There comes a moment when the world you thought you understood quietly slips out of your hands. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. The sky does not crack open. People still go to work, clocks still tick, and yet something inside you knows without a doubt that the old way of seeing no longer fits. I want to begin right there, in that silent moment, because awakening never starts with certainty. It starts with doubt. I have found that awakening is not an achievement. It is a disruption. It interrupts the stories you were taught to live by. It loosens the ground beneath your feet, and the first thing it does, almost without asking your permission, is make you question everything you once assumed was solid. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever reached a point where your beliefs, your goals, even your sense of who you are suddenly felt questionable, as if they were borrowed ideas rather than lived truths? If so, I invite you to share that experience in the comments below, because this questioning is far more common than we admit, and far less dangerous than we fear. One of the facts I want to state plainly is this: awakening does not give you new answers. It takes away old certainties, and that is precisely why it feels unsettling. The mind is deeply attached to conclusions. It prefers a false sense of knowing over an honest sense of wonder. When those conclusions begin to dissolve, the mind panics and calls it confusion. But confusion, I assure you, is not a mistake. Confusion is the beginning of intelligence. When awakening begins, you start to notice how much of your life has been lived on autopilot. You followed paths that were laid out long before you arrived, paths defined by culture, family, education, and fear. This is not an accusation. It is simply a fact of human conditioning. Most of what we call choice is repetition wearing a disguise. And when you awaken, repetition becomes visible. You begin to question why success looks the way it does, why happiness is postponed into the future, why love is so often tangled with fear. These questions are not cynical, they are honest. They arise because awareness has turned back on itself and begun to ask, is this actually true for me? Here is the argument that many resist. Awakening threatens the ego not because it destroys it, but because it exposes it. The ego is not evil. It is simply a habit, a pattern of identification that believes it must always be certain, always in control, always right. When you start questioning everything, the ego feels as though it is losing its grip on reality, and in a sense it is. But what it is losing is not reality itself. It is losing its monopoly on interpretation. You may notice at this stage that even spiritual ideas begin to feel suspicious. You question teachings, teachers, philosophies not out of rebellion, but out of sincerity. You no longer want second-hand truths. You want to see for yourself. This is not disrespect, this is maturity. A fact worth remembering is that genuine understanding cannot be inherited. It must be discovered, and discovery requires doubt. This is why awakening can feel lonely. The questions you are asking are not always welcomed by a world that prefers neat answers. Society is structured around agreement, not inquiry. When you question everything, you step slightly outside the rhythm of collective certainty. And yet this questioning is not meant to isolate you, it is meant to return you to direct experience. Notice how when belief systems weaken, the present moment becomes louder. Sensations feel sharper. Silence becomes noticeable. You are no longer buffered by constant interpretation. Life feels raw, sometimes uncomfortably so. This rawness is not a problem. It is intimacy with reality. Let me make this clear. Awakening does not make you negative. It makes you honest. It removes the filters that once softened the truth. And truth, when encountered directly, does not always feel comforting at first. You may question your career, your relationships, your ambitions, not because they are wrong, but because you are finally asking whether they are authentic. This is a crucial distinction. Awakening does not demand that you abandon your life. It asks that you see it clearly. Here is a call to reflection. Instead of asking, "What should I believe now?" try asking, "What am I actually experiencing?" That shift alone changes everything. It moves you from borrowed certainty into lived awareness. And lived awareness does not rush. You begin to see that many of your fears were conceptual. They existed more in thought than in reality. When beliefs loosen, fear loses its narrative support. It still arises, but it no longer defines you. This is the beginning of freedom, not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from unconscious obedience. Awakening makes you question everything, because everything worth living should be examined, not to tear it down, but to see whether it stands on truth or habit. This questioning is not an end, it is an opening. And if you feel as though you are standing in that opening right now, uncertain, curious, slightly ungrounded, then you are not lost. You are waking up. As this questioning deepens, something subtle but unmistakable happens. You realize that the discomfort you feel is not coming from life itself, but from the collapse of the mental scaffolding you once leaned on. The world has not suddenly become unstable, your explanations of it have. That distinction matters more than most people ever discover. Here is a simple fact that awakening reveals very clearly. Beliefs were never reality. They were maps. Useful maps, yes, but still drawings on paper. And when you mistake the map for the territory, you live at a distance from life. Awakening begins the moment you notice the difference. This is why everything feels negotiable all of a sudden. Moral ideas, social roles, even spiritual identities come under scrutiny. You begin to ask, who would I be without these labels? That question is frightening only because it has never been asked sincerely before. The mind resists this stage fiercely. It says, if I question everything, I will have nothing to stand on. But that is an illusion. What actually disappears is false ground. What remains is direct contact. You may notice that certainty now feels artificial. People who speak in absolutes seem strangely tense. Opinions sound rehearsed. Even your own old convictions echo hollowly when repeated. This is not arrogance. It is sensitivity. Awareness has become too refined to accept cheap conclusions. Here is an argument worth considering carefully. Confusion is not the opposite of awakening. Clinging is. When you stop clinging, clarity unfolds naturally, but not in the rigid way the mind expects. It arrives as flexibility, not final answers. At this point, many people worry they are losing themselves. But what is actually happening is far more precise. You are losing a fictional self, a collection of ideas about who you are supposed to be. The real self was never something you could lose, because it was never an object to begin with. This is where questioning turns inward. You start to ask, who is the one doing all this thinking? That is not a philosophical puzzle. It is an experiential inquiry. When followed honestly, it does not lead to an answer. It leads to silence. And silence, I must tell you, is not empty. It is intelligent. It is aware. It is where thought arises and dissolves. When you rest there, even briefly, you notice that life continues perfectly well without constant commentary. Breathing happens. Sounds appear. The body moves. Awareness does not need supervision. This realization can feel destabilizing because it undermines the belief that control is necessary for existence. But watch closely and you will see that control was always partial, imagined, and exhausting. Here is a direct call to action. Notice how often you demand certainty before allowing yourself to be present. Notice how often you postpone living until you figure things out. Awakening invites you to reverse that order. Instead of understanding first and living later, you live first and let understanding follow. This shift changes how you relate to problems. Problems become processes rather than threats. Questions become doorways rather than obstacles. You stop demanding immediate resolution and start allowing insight to ripen. You may also notice a growing compassion, not sentimental but clear-eyed. When you see how much of human behavior is driven by unexamined fear and inherited beliefs, Judgment loses its appeal. You understand without excusing. You see without hardening. This is not superiority. It is intimacy with the human condition. Awakening makes you question everything because it removes the need to defend anything. When identity loosens, defensiveness fades. You can listen without preparing a rebuttal. You can change your mind without humiliation. You can say, "I don't know," without collapse. And that is a rare freedom. If part one was about the shock of questioning, this stage is about learning to dwell inside the questions without rushing to escape them. It is about trusting awareness more than conclusions. Because conclusions end inquiry. Awareness keeps it alive. And the deeper you allow this questioning to go, the more you discover that what you truly are has never been threatened by uncertainty at all. It has been waiting for it. Eventually, if you allow this process to unfold without trying to control it, questioning itself begins to change character. It no longer feels like a problem that needs solving. It becomes a natural movement of awareness, like breathing or listening. You stop interrogating life and start conversing with it. Here is an important fact that becomes obvious only at this stage. Awakening does not leave you in endless doubt. It leaves you beyond the need for psychological certainty. There is a profound difference. Doubt belongs to the mind. Freedom belongs to awareness. You begin to see that many of the questions that once tormented you were based on a false assumption, the assumption that life owes you explanations before it can be trusted. When that assumption dissolves, trust no longer depends on answers. It arises directly from experience. Reality does not argue for itself. It simply is. At this point, questioning turns from anxiety into curiosity. You ask not because you are lost, but because you are alive. Wonder replaces fear. Mystery replaces tension. You stop trying to pin reality down and start moving with it. This is where awakening becomes quietly joyful, not ecstatic in a dramatic sense, but deeply sane. You no longer feel the urge to convince others or convert them to your perspective. You recognize that everyone awakens in their own rhythm, or not at all, and that this too is part of the dance. Here is an argument worth holding gently. Certainty is not wisdom. Openness is. Wisdom knows how provisional every viewpoint is, including its own. That is why it listens more than it declares. You may notice now that questioning no longer destabilizes your life. You can question your thoughts without collapsing. You can question your emotions without suppressing them. You can question your identity without needing to replace it with a new one. This is maturity of awareness. The world begins to feel lighter, not because it has become simpler, but because you are no longer carrying it inside your head as a problem to be solved. You meet each moment as it arrives, not as a test, but as a conversation. Even suffering changes here. Pain still occurs, that is unavoidable, but psychological suffering diminishes because resistance weakens. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this asking of me now?" That shift alone transforms experience. Here is a direct call to reflection. Notice how often you seek final conclusions about yourself. Notice how often you want to arrive somewhere and be done. Awakening shows you that arrival is an illusion. Life is movement, not destination. And when you stop demanding arrival, you begin to enjoy the journey without needing it to justify itself. You realize then that questioning was never meant to destroy meaning. It was meant to strip away borrowed meanings so that living meaning could emerge on its own. Meaning that grows from direct experience does not need defending. It feels self-evident. This is why simplicity returns at the far end of questioning. Not the simplicity of ignorance, but the simplicity of clarity. You still think, but thought no longer dominates. You still plan, but plans no longer imprison you. You are present. Awakening makes you question everything, so that you can finally rest in what does not need questioning. Not an idea, not a belief, but awareness itself quietly watching, effortlessly knowing, without commentary. And from that place, life is no longer something you need to figure out. It is something you participate in.